Can you see the presentation here?
Yes.
Okay. Now I was kind of forced to use a template that my university provides,
Okay.
so that they take all the credit for whatever I'm doing right now. So here you can see my email address if you want to spam me with whatever emails that you come up with, and you can learn more about my university if that's what you're interested in. If you want to do a master's degree somewhere in Europe, in Central Europe, in the heart of Europe, then I would very much recommend to consider KU Leuven. So the outline. Oh, hello, Martin.
And Andrea.
And do we have?
Oh, yes, Andrea and Martin joined.
Okay, hello to both of you. Before we start the actual thing, would you like to very quickly introduce yourselves and tell us why you're here?
Hi, I'm Martin. I'm one of the chairs for Yerevan, and I'm here to learn things.
Okay. Thank you very much. Andrea, are you also here? Can you hear us?
Maybe not.
Okay, maybe not right now, but still, if you come up with any point that you would like to raise, or a question, or anything, feel free once again for the newly joined members. Feel free to stop me at any point and ask a question, or if your mic, for example, doesn't work for a reason, feel free to add a question in the chat menu, which I can't access right now. So if there is anything going on in the chat, I would very much appreciate if one of you.
I'll tell. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So the outline of the presentation looks like this. It is quite a brief one, but I'll try to keep it as informative / useful, hopefully, as possible. So okay, what is the European Parliament? It is the most democratic, or some people state that it is the only democratic body that exists in the European Union, in a sense that it is the body that's directly elected by the ordinary people, the citizens of the European Union. And as you may see at the bottom end of the presentation, this year actually there will be another cycle of elections. So between 23rd and 26th of May, there will be a EP, European Parliamentary elections, where you can as well cast your vote. So as I stated, it is one of the main bodies of the European Union that is directly elected by the citizens. It has legislative functions, it has supervisory functions, as well as budgetary functions, and we'll touch upon those in a minute. It has 751 MEPs, or members of the European Parliament, but as you will notice in the next slide, the number of MEPs will most probably decrease in a short amount of time. Those people are elected according to the principle of digressive proportionality, which means that they are elected in proportion to the number of citizens that a given member state has. So in that regard, I think Estonia, for example, or Malta or Cyprus would be the member states with the least number of members of the European Parliament, while countries like France and Germany, maybe the UK for now, would have the highest number, because there are just many more people living there. But what digressive proportionality means is that there can't be less than 6 MEPs from any member state, and there can't be more than 96 MEPs. So the countries that have the smallest number of citizens would get 6, which is in disproportion to the number of citizens. Otherwise, it would be much smaller. But that was the decision to give them a bit more bargaining power. Who's the president of the European Parliament? Until recently, it was Martin Schulz, but since his departure, Antonio Tajani has taken his seat, and he is not only is he the president of the European Parliament, but the function of being the president of the European Parliament has an important value to the institution in that he is the only person that can represent the body to other EU institutions, and he is the person that represents the European Parliament to the outside world. He, as the president, is the only person that can give a final go-ahead to the European Union budget. So once negotiations on the budget are finalized, he has to, as a president, ratify it. Without his quote-unquote permission, there won't be a budget for the next year. Where is the European Parliament located? It is actually located in 3 different cities, in the city of Strasbourg, Brussels, and Luxembourg. And these 3 cities have very specific roles, which is sometimes a thing that's not pinpointed. But as you may see, for example, there is quite an important distinction between what Brussels, what the building of the EP in Brussels is for, versus what Strasbourg, for example, says for. And it was established in 1952, so it's one of the oldest organizations, institutions, bodies that represents the European Union. It was restructured several times, but it has been bearing this name since 1962, and first direct elections took place in 1979. Since then, after certain treaties, especially Maastricht and Lisbon, the role and responsibilities of the EP have changed a bit, but there have been no significant changes since Lisbon. So as I touched upon the number of MEPs, here is a slide that I kindly borrowed from the European Parliament website myself, which demonstrates how the number of MEPs will decrease after Brexit. So if the UK is to leave the European Union before the next election, so if Brexit happens before May 23rd or May 26th, then the number of seats will decrease from 751 to 705, and the principle of digressive proportionality will still be kept, in a sense that Cyprus will still have 6 seats, but in that regard, none of the member states would really suffer, except for, in this regard, obviously, would suffer from Brexit, since some of the member states will even get 1 or maybe couple or even 5, as is the case for Spain and France, more seats, while none would be extracted the number of seats that they have. So you would even either keep the number of seats that you have, or you get some more in proportion to, again, the number of citizens that you have. Okay, we touched upon the 3 main functions of the European Parliament. As you all know, the first 2 functions are well known to almost everyone. So Parliament is there for legislation, so it comes as no surprise that the main function of the European Parliament is to legislate. How it does so by passing EU laws. That happens together with the Council of the European Union. And I won't touch upon the institutional triangle, but towards the end of this section, I'll show you a pretty nice presentation slash visual on how this procedure works. And I think all, if not, at least most of you, if not all of you, know that only the European Commission can propose legislation, and then after a series of hearings between the Council of the European Union, or the Council of Ministers, and the European Parliament, if there is no point of contention, that's how legislation passes in the European Union. And shall the European Union propose to sign an international treaty, an international agreement, then in this case, the text of the agreement shall be presented to the European Parliament. So the members of the European Parliament would argue based on the text that they receive, and based on their decision, based on the principle of proportional majority, that's how the international agreement would be signed and ratified, or not signed and passed back for certain improvements. If there is a case of enlargement, and the last enlargement in the European Union was, I think, in 2013, when Croatia joined it, if a candidate state has matured enough to be considered for becoming a member state of the European Union, then this procedure will once again be discussed in the European Parliament, and they would have to formally ratify their agreement with this country becoming a member state. Very similarly to how a government and parliament work in member states, whereas every year at the beginning of the year, a government proposes its annual plan or a set of activities, at least, that depends on the that differs from member state to member state. But nonetheless, beginning of the year, most of the time, a government proposes the annual plan of what they want to achieve, and then the parliament ratifies it or it doesn't. Very similar to this, the Commission proposes a work program and passes it back to Parliament, and then based on that, Parliament would ask the Commission to propose legislation on the matter. The second function is, again, very similar to any function that a parliament would have in a parliamentary system, or many systems, with the exception of the no, I think in pretty much all the systems that works. That's the budgetary function. So the Council and the European Parliament together establish the budget of the European Union, and they also have the authority and the power to approve the long-term budget, which is most of the time a 5-year budget for the European Union. I'm sorry, and that long-term budget is often referred to as the multi-annual financial framework. So it's an annual budget and it's a long-term budget, mostly a 5-year budget, but there might be divergence as well. The last function that the European Parliament has is the supervisory function. So it supervises actually many things. As the European Parliament is quoted as the democratic body, democratic institution in the European Union, then it has to supervise the democratic scrutiny of other institutions. It has to make sure that all the institutions in the European Union adhere to the democratic values and the spirit of democracy, and there are no missteps in that regard. When it comes to elections of the president of the Commission, the only body that can do that is the European Parliament. So the president of the future president of the Commission is presented to the Parliament, and there are a series of deliberations based on which they can vote for this person, or if they think that there are certain breaches of whatever sort, then they can disapprove of him or her becoming the next president, and then someone else needs to be presented for their consideration. And in a much similar way, they have to approve the Commission as a body, and without that, the Commission would resign, which is again something that's very similar to what parliaments do. Parliaments approve the government as a body, and if there is no approval of the prime minister or the president and the approval of the government, then the prime minister / the president and the cabinet have to resign. So quite similar. They have to, in a similar way to the way they have to ratify or approve the budget, they also have approved budget expenditure, which is a term which for this instance is called granting discharge. So that's giving a special permission on how budget or the money should be spent. Without that, the Commission has no authority to go ahead and start discharging. If there are petitions, and if you go to the Commission, if you go to the Parliament website, and you can see that there is a standing committee on petitions. If there are petitions coming from the citizens of the European Union, then it is upon the European Parliament to examine, firstly within the Committee on Petitions, examine the problem that the petition is based on, and if there is a cause of concern for whatever reason, then they can set up inquiries and request the Commission or whatever body that the inquiry is addressed towards to present them proofs or satisfy the inquiry of the citizen. The monetary policy of the central bank, although the central bank is obviously the institution that controls or oversees the monetary policy in the European Union. As you know, I think central bank won't be covered, so I'll just go ahead. Central bank is a body that where all the member states that have euro as their currency are part of. So the monetary policy, the single currency of the European Union, is controlled and oversaw by the central bank. But when it comes to annual monetary policy, or in terms of other unforeseen circumstances, there can be a series of discussions between the Parliament and the central bank on how to consider the situation and how to act upon it. One of the last things in this regard is the Parliament's authority to question the Commission and the Council. Annually there are set times when members of the Commission, members of the Council would come to the Parliament, and there is an open Q&A between members of the European Parliament and members of the Commission and the Council, and every single member of the Parliament can ask whatever questions that presumably their constituency is interested in, and they can, once they receive the response, they will go back to their constituency and, adhering to the democratic principles or the spirit of democracy, they would present what the findings were on that regard. And finally, the Parliament has a duty to observe elections. Again, something that's very common to parliaments of Many other countries, if there is an election going on, then parliaments would usually send a mission to observe those elections and then write a report whether these principles adhere to democratic values, values of human rights, and many basic human rights. And in a very similar way, that's what the European Parliament does as well. Any questions so far?
Question.
Yes.
Regarding the discussing monetary policy with the European Central Bank, what exactly is the specific right that the European Parliament has, or on which level does this happen? Is it that some kind of committee has the right to send a letter to the European Central Bank and then they must meet with them, or how does this work?
Okay, thank you very much. So what I would say in this regard is the presidency, first of all, the presidency of the European Parliament has the absolute duty to discuss monetary policy with the central bank. So if there are any shifts in a monetary policy that the central bank wants to implement, then this has to be discussed with the presidency of the European Parliament. And if there are certain contentions between the two bodies, then this issue will be brought to the discussion in the plenary of the European Parliament. But again, if any committee that has anything to do with monetary policy, they can become participant in the process. But what this entails is, by no means does the European Parliament discriminate its standing committee's right to send out questions. So if if any committee, let's say the Committee on Monetary Affairs wants to ask a specific question or inquire on something, then they can set up an inquiry. I think this is the procedure that would work best unless there is a concrete problem. If there is an extraordinary situation that would require immediate action, then the Parliament, with coming from a conclusion by its standing committee, can initiate immediate talks with the central bank. But if it's not the case, then usually standing committees would set up inquiries.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. We have reached one of the final slides of this section, and it is on how the Parliament actually works. So it works in two different ways. It works within committees that prepare legislation. So what happens is, I don't want to jump too much forward, but once the Parliament receives a draft legislation, then it is firstly discussed in the committee that prepares a brief, a short report on what they think about that piece of legislation, which is then discussed in the plenary session. There are currently 20 committees in the European Parliament, and there are 2 subcommittees, which are Trois and Sede, that are under AFET. For these 2 committees, the situation is a bit different. What they do is, AFET would get the legislation, and then it has in real life the authority to delegate discussion on a certain matter to one of its subcommittees, and then the report by subcommittee would be sent back to the committee, which will then act as lead when this issue is discussed in a plenary session. There are also, or there might be, special committees. So right now there is a single special committee, which is Tax 3, Committee on Taxation, which can, as any other committee, set up inquiries or look into certain things. But unlike other committees, it does not have does not have the full authority of writing reports and presenting them, or acting as a lead on matters of legislation. But what it does is it serves for an amount of time, and then it provides annual reports, but at the end it provides a final report. And after the final report to the Parliament has been submitted, the committee is dissolved. And there might be committees of inquiry which have quite the similar purpose, but unlike special committees, which are committees that are called upon on ordinary issues, for example, Tax 3 that we have right now entails there has been Committee Tax 1 and Committee Tax 2, so that's a business as usual pretty much for the Parliament. Whereas a committee that was called TER, which was Committee on Terrorism, was only created because there was an extraordinary situation with regard to rise of terrorism, and Parliament decided to act upon it quickly. So they had to set up a committee to quickly look into this problem and then submit a report, and then the committee would be dissolved. So committees of inquiry, you would normally not see two similar committees of inquiry in the Parliament.
May I ask a question very fast? In terms of who decides which committees to call upon? So, like as you said, it might be a circumstance thing. So if there is something going on, then we would call upon a specific committee. So who are the people who decide which committee to call? And I think the question that a lot of people usually ask is, who are the committees like consist of? So are these experts, representatives of nation states, and so on?
Of course. Well, committees, to start with the simpler question, committees consist of members of Parliament. Those are simply members of Parliament from any member state that are interested in becoming part of a committee. And every single member of Parliament can become part of different committees. It is up to them to decide on what specific committee that they want to be part of. And once that's set, they will be part of that committee. The committee would usually have a chair and a vice chair, and that's decided by the members of that committee. And when it comes to what their duty is, most of the time it is up to the chair to report on a specific matter, while if for whatever reason the chair can't do that, then the deputy chair would act on their behalf. Now, it was rightly pointed out that there might be cases where there is some sort of contention between, okay, is this is this an AFED issue, or is this a DEVE issue for a reason? So how do we decide, and how do we pick up the right committee that should act upon this? So how that is handled, I will actually answer in a minute, because I think this next thing. No, I'll just answer it right now. So it's part of the bureaucratic process, to be sure. Once a matter has been brought up, it is usually clearly pinpointed that this committee within Parliament would be the lead in this regard, whereas this council in the European Council, which is also Council of the European Union, not the European Council, which is also part of the legislative process, will be leading the process from on behalf of the council. And most of the time, it is quite clear with regard to what committee will be leading the discussion in this regard. But quite often, it also happens that two different committees might have a say on the matter. And what happens, and this actually happens all the time, there is always a committee, reporting committee, and there is a shadow committee, a committee that reviews the same matter, that has specific interests in this regard, and that also presents its own report, which is called shadow report. So for example, I think around 15 years ago, there was a discussion on advertisement of tobacco products. Since advertisement is an economic issue, then the Committee on Economic Affairs was the lead in this regard. But since tobacco products are hazardous for health, then the Committee on Public Health had very specific interests. So they were appointed as the shadow committee. And the shadow committee proposed its own measures, objections, and in this specific story, in this specific case, shadow committee, Committee on Public Health, was much more active than the leading committee. And most of the changes that happened were due to the work that the shadow committee did. Now, every committee has its own set of experts. If you go to a committee website, you can see that there are reports, and underneath you can see who are the experts that worked here. There are certain experts in every single committee, but committees are free to address external experts or bring them into a discussion. There is also a body that's called Think Tank of the European Union that helps committees of the Parliament to uncover certain problems. It provides ideas, it provides information, it provides whatever that members of the committee, due to the tight schedule that they have, can't normally process so much information themselves. So the think tank provides all that information firsthand to the committee. But for that to happen, the committee has to obviously approach the think tank itself and ask for their support. In a similar way, the committee has to approach its own experts or external experts and ask for their support. Otherwise, well, they won't get it. Did this answer your question, Mariam?
Yes, apart from the committees, which you were mentioning that sometimes committees which are new need to be called upon. So I was also wondering who decides that they need new committees to appear, let's say.
Okay. So what happens in this case is every single member of the Parliament can propose creation of a committee. They will have to draft the statement, draft the proposal, and specify why they want this committee to exist. And then firstly, it is discussed in the Council, which is a specific special body of the European Parliament. The Council is a body that unites the presidency of the Parliament and presidency of the parties that are represented in the European Parliament. And the Council sets a motion for discussing this specific issue if it is in agreement with the principles of how a statement or a proposal should be prepared. So it's simply technical. And then when it happens, there are special sessions during the plenary session that are dedicated to such matters. Usually they take place towards the end of the year, but if there is a very extraordinary situation, and creation of TER was such a case, because the push for creating TER was the Bataclan terrorist attack that happened in France, different sets of terrorist attacks that happened in France and then in Belgium and other member states. So there was a consensus that this sort of committee should be presented, and a group of parliamentarians prepared the text, which was discussed, and then I think pretty much immediately ratified. So in this case, it took no time. Otherwise, if the matter is not exactly popular, then it can be dropped during the first hearing. It does need, obviously, it needs consensus among members of parliament. And then plenary sessions is when all the discussion among members of parliament takes place. These sessions are normally held in Strasbourg, where several weeks every year members of parliament unite to discuss issues. If there is a matter that couldn't be decided in a set time, then upon returning to Brussels, members of the European Parliament will continue to discuss that issue. But normally, what the European Parliament tries to do is all the matters that are part of a plenary session should be discussed in a given time in Strasbourg, so that when members of parliament go back to Brussels, there's nothing left, pretty much. And the European Union has 24 languages, very technical. If a member of parliament doesn't speak, I don't know, English or French or German, it is not an impediment for them because there is automatic translation. So you can make a speech in any of the 24 official languages, and then this will be translated into all the other 23 languages. If anyone was wondering why, I don't know, what happens if someone speaks in their native language, which many people don't understand. So that's it for this part. I'll quickly show you the procedure that was for the ordinary legislative procedure when it comes to only from the perspective of the European Parliament. So once a wait, I think I have to stop sharing and then share something else. Yeah, so that's the thing. I will quickly rush you through this because I think you will hear this quite a lot in the future as well. So it's only up to the Commission to propose legislation, and the Parliament is the first body to receive that legislation. And then it first goes to the committee, then the committee comes with a decision that's presented to the Parliament, and the Parliament decides on what they want to propose. Then it goes to the Council, then it comes back to the Parliament, then it goes to the Council once again if there are contentions between the Council and the Parliament. And if the role of the Parliament stops here, if there are no objections from the Parliament to what the Council proposed upon getting the text from them, then the legislation will be approved. If there are any contentions after that between the Council and the Committee, then there will be a conciliation committee, which is something else to keep in mind. So the conciliation committee is a committee where an equal number of members from the European Parliament and the Council would join. On behalf of the European Parliament, most people who would join this are obviously the members of Parliament who have an interest in this regard and who want to participate in further discussing, while on behalf of the Council, there will be a number of people participating, but the Council that leads the debate in the Council of the European Union, the Council of Ministers, so that the minister that's responsible for that will take lead, and maybe some other ministers that are part of that specific council would also be represented in the group that's in the Conciliation Committee on behalf of the Council. And are we fine so far? Okay, so very quickly, we have around more or less 10 minutes. I will rush you through, if I'm capable of finding where it is. Okay. Okay, so this is on compliance, and it is a presentation that was created by a friend of mine, which I thought was kind of interesting. And compliance to EU law is something that's not very outspoken, so I thought at least some people would be interested in knowing more about this. Okay, what is EU law? I expect people to know this, but EU law comes from EU law comes from three main sources, which are primary sources, and those are treaties. As you heard in the past, when it comes to international treaties, the European Parliament has to approve them. So that's that. Then there is legislation that's specific to the European Union, and those are the secondary sources. And we have regulations, directives, as well as decisions, recommendations, and opinions. Recommendations and opinions, as you might know, are not mandatory for the member states to follow, while regulations and directives very much are. And regulations have to be followed in the text, according to the text that's written, while directives have to be transposed in each member state. So that's where problems come. The fourth source is territory sources, and those are the case law from ECJ. If there is a ruling by the European Court of Justice, then it becomes part of legislation, and there are general principles of EU law, the spirit of EU law, and those are international treaties, not specifically EU related. What is compliance? What we mean by compliance is that there is a piece of law that has to be implemented by member states. It has to be implemented correctly. It has to be implemented in a timely way. And to make sure that that's the case, the Commission would monitor the process. One aspect where this is more evident is when it comes to directives, because directives, although they have to be implemented, but it is up to member states to decide on some of the peculiar aspects of how they want to implement it in their own country, since it's not just the text that has to be translated into their native language, and that's how it works. There is a process. And what it means is that they have to consider their own administrative practices. They have to consider timing. And oftentimes that doesn't happen. And we would have, if a member state is aware that it won't have the time to transpose a directive, then it can communicate this issue with the Commission and ask for more time, which the Commission can give, but in certain cases it would refuse to, and it's up to the Commission to decide. And in that case, we would end up with non-communication problem, when the directive was transposed late, or was incorrectly transposed, or transposition was incomplete. What would happen in that case is the European Parliament would, the European Commission would approach the member state once again and tell them that they have not transposed the directive or transposed it incorrectly. And if, after a series of talks, if the member state would refuse to follow the instructions that they would receive from the Commission, then, as you may see at the very bottom right of this slide, there can be a formal infringement proceeding. So, to be very brief in this regard, if you can see how this procedure works. So there are a series of talks. The Commission would send a letter. The member state would come back. Then they would receive a reasoned opinion, which is another letter. And then, if no changes are implemented, then the Court of Justice would rule which of the parties was correct in this case. So, coming back to the tobacco advertisement thing that I spoke about earlier, in this very case, Germany, for example, refused to transpose this directive. It refused immediately. And it was actually Germany that brought the Commission upon to the Court of Justice, stating that this was against the spirit of free market, and the Commission didn't have authority to rush into this. But ultimately, the Court of Justice decided that the directive was complying with the spirit of EU law, and the judgment was against Germany, which was forced to then transpose quickly this directive. Then, if you are interested in finding documents on this, then there are 2 times every year the Commission provides statistics and reports on compliance and non-compliance to EU law. In a similar way, the Commission would file out infringement decisions, stating which countries have infringed and how it was decided. And then you can also find, for example, ECJ judgments on Curia, which is the website where ECJ rulings are published. And then you would be surprised to know that there might be cases where a country didn't really transpose a directive or didn't do that on time, but they avoided any punishment. Why is that the case? Well, it's because, to be very brief in this, it's because the Commission doesn't have too much time and there's too much legislation going on. So it's easy for a matter to slip from the attention of the European Commission and stay on stay the way it is for a very long amount of time. And I have an example on my hand where a member state didn't transpose a directive for 12 years, and only after 12 years did the Commission notice that there was a problem and launched the infringement procedure. Now, why does infringement happen? Yes. No? Yeah. So there are different reasons why member states can't transpose a matter, which is sometimes because a directive isn't a good fit for them. There are certain barriers that hinder member states from transposing it. In some other member states, there might be different political priorities. So if we have a very left-wing or a very right-wing government, and an aspect of EU law is not a priority for them, then they would be not very much inclined to start transposition. Sometimes, and this is, for example, this is always the case for Luxembourg. They have very small capacity and there's too much legislation, and 60 to 70% of legislation is not transposed on time. just because they don't have too much manpower to do that. But in some other member states, there is just not enough administrative capacity. They are still developing their own capacity. This is the case for many of the Eastern or newly coming member states. But there might be also other issues, like, for example, France is one of the member states that is pretty much always late in transposing directives, but it's not because of priorities, it's not because of their capacity, it's because of the very lengthy administrative procedure that takes France to transpose even the tiniest directives. And in certain aspects, there might be veto players, large multinational businesses that have their own interests. Again, tobacco directive. Tobacco producing companies had their very clear interests in that they didn't want this legislation to pass, and they pressured many of the member states to vote against it. So that would be the case, and even when it passed, they still pressured many member states to not to transpose it, hoping that the Commission would backpedal. And I think that is pretty much it when it comes to transposition. I try to keep it as short as possible, but if you have any questions, feel free to come back. I can also share the presentation with you. It contains many more information that I managed to squeeze in this amount of time. And I will give the floor once again to Lucas or Mariam.